Hi everyone, this is Karen from the Peace Discipline channel, where you can learn all about non-violent discipline. Today's video is part of a series on what not to do in discipline, and we will be looking at lecturing. This video will be relevant to parents as well as to teachers and anyone else who cares for or works with children. What is a lecture? It's when you speak to your child, admonishing and advising them and setting them straight on the things they're doing wrong, and try to steer them in the right direction with your words. It sounds something like this. You know what you children need to realize, blah, blah, blah. Your problem is blah, blah, blah. What you kids don't understand is blah, blah, blah. You know, when we were young, we would never have blah, blah, blah. And if you want to make it in this world, what you need to learn is to blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. But what do children do when we lecture them? I run workshops in different cultural contexts, and wherever I ask this question, what do children do when people lecture them? I get the same answer. It seems to be something really universal. They switch off. Children switch off when you lecture them. I never get a response that says, oh, you know, it really helps. They listen. I'm really getting through to them. Everybody says they switch off. They even use the same words. So how do you feel as a teacher or parent when you're trying to get through to a child with your good advice and wise admonitions and they tune you out? Feeling like you're not getting through to someone, especially someone you love, is never a good feeling. When you're lecturing a child, as soon as you see them switch off, which is usually right near the beginning, you start to feel a lot worse, frustrated and possibly angry. And that's when things start to escalate. Perhaps you raise your voice. Perhaps you start hammering harder with your words. You say harsher things. Perhaps you exaggerate how bad the child's offense was in the first place. You're trying to get a reaction, trying to get through to them. Perhaps your fantasy at this point is that the child would go, oh, you're right, I was wrong, I'm so sorry. But does this ever happen? Once a child's switched off, that's not the kind of thing you're going to hear. If anything, it will look to you like the child just showing you a lot of attitude. To illustrate this, picture that your child is like a snail, and when you started to lecture, they withdrew into their shell. Now think about whether anyone would have any luck poking at that snail in the shell and going, come out, what's wrong with you? Why won't you come out of there? Come out, there's something I need you to see. Come out, look at me when I'm talking to you. Anybody think the snail's going to come out? What a snail needs to come out of their shell is to feel safe. Withdrawing like that is protective. If we want that to be different, we need to use methods which keep the child feeling safe while we're trying to get through to them. Children need to feel safe enough to be able to pay attention to the things that we need to show them. When we lecture them, they feel hammered, and it can be hurtful if the adult starts saying worse and worse things just to get a response. So let's stop this unconstructive practice. It's annoying, off-putting, and very ineffective, and it raises your blood pressure for nothing. So what can we do instead of lecturing? Well, the obvious option would be don't lecture. You don't necessarily need to replace it. You could just cut down on how much you admonish your child. That would probably already be a big improvement. But there are some skills that we can use instead. I'm not going to mention all of them because there are really a lot of different skills that we could use. But to give some idea, let's have a look at 3 good replacement options for lecturing. Firstly, instead of lecturing, listen. As adults, we don't always realize that when we're trying to get through to children, we talk way too much. If we were to look at how much the child gets to talk and how much the adult gets to talk, the balance is really off. So instead of lecturing, try listening. Shift the balance so that the child talks more by asking open-ended questions so that you can get a better idea of how the child feels about the situation. You'd be amazed how much this helps. To start with, the child is much less likely to switch off. They'll stay engaged, talking to you, and if you listen well, it will help them to process the situation and possibly come up with a lot of the things that you would have told them in a lecture, but they'll come up with it themselves, which is much better. They'll feel that they are choosing a certain path rather than being steered along it against their will. If you're not familiar with asking open-ended questions, this is when you ask your child something that has not just a yes or no answer, but encourages them to speak. Questions like, and how did you feel when that happened? Or what was that like for you? Or what are your options now? Once you've asked an open-ended question, listen to what your child has to say. Adults are often very bad at listening. When the child starts to speak, they immediately see something they can fix or advice they can give and jump in and start lecturing again. And you will see the reaction in the child. They'll switch off. When we listen to children, we need to really make a space for them to speak. You may feel like you're having to hold yourself back a little. Then also, as they're speaking, you might give a little bit of feedback to check that your understanding is correct and to show the child that you're with them as they process. So you might say something like, so you felt quite shocked when that happened, or so when she said that, you felt quite upset, or so you were really frustrated. These are all ways of reflecting back what the child is saying, and you'll know if you're on the right track because they'll show something called a recognition response, where they'll say yes, or you'll see on their face that they feel encouraged in what they're saying. So option number 1, instead of lecturing, listen. It'll make a huge difference. Secondly, instead of hammering on with a lecture, try asking directly for what you want. If you're giving guidance for future situations, say, next time I would like you to, and explain what you would like the child to do, without giving a whole lot of explanation and reasons and advice. Just keep it simple, like, next time your cell phone goes dead and you need to contact me, I would like you to, or next time your brother does that, I would like you to, and tell them simply what you would like them to do. If it's more in the immediate, so you're hammering on with a lecture because you're hoping that the child will apologize to you or respond to you immediately in some way, try dropping the lecture and asking directly for what you're looking for. You might say something like, what I need from you now is an apology. Or you might use modeling. Modeling is a great way to prompt a child to do something. Perhaps a child crashed into someone, and instead of lecturing them about how they need to be more careful and all of that, you say, "Ooh, that hurt. Sorry, Emily," or "Sorry, Vusi," modeling that the child should say sorry to the person that they crashed into. This way, the child knows what you want and they can copy what you say. It's a way of teaching them what's appropriate in the situation. So instead of lecturing, we could listen more, or we could ask directly for what we want. But what about the fact that if you were giving a lecture, you probably had quite a bit of information to share with your child? I mean, you were trying to share your pearls of wisdom, and you might worry about when you'll get a chance to do that if you can't lecture them. So how can we convey important information without lecturing, which tends to cause children to switch off? My third suggestion is to use a remedial story. This is one of my favorites in the toolkit of nonviolent discipline tools. The remedial story means that you tell a story with a message. This is probably one of the most ancient discipline tools. In countries all over the world, in all cultures, stories are told, stories designed to teach or pass on some important piece of wisdom. As a parent and teacher, I've found this skill very, very useful and also a lot of fun. So if you're going to use a remedial story, think of a thing that you are going to lecture your child on, and instead of lecturing them, build the information you want to give your child into a story. So let's illustrate this with an example. When one of our children was about 7 or 8 years old, he went through a phase where he rushed everything. He would write as quickly as possible. He would do any crafts that he was doing at school as quickly as possible, as if he wanted to win and be the first to finish. Unfortunately, this had a very negative impact on the quality of work which he was producing. So my first response to that was to speak to him about it and to tell him why rushing things was a bad idea and why he should go slowly. And before my eyes, I saw that response of him just switching off. And I realized that I was lecturing. I wasn't going to get through to him in this way. And so I invented a story. The story was about two builders who lived in the same village. The one was called Mr. Hasty and the other was called Mr. Take Care. And I told the story over a number of days and weeks in different installments. The children would actually ask for the story because they enjoyed it. We could tell it at the breakfast table, in the car going to school, or just any other time that we were together. They would often prompt me and say, "Do you have any more stories of Mr. Hasty?" Because they found the stories entertaining. All kinds of things would happen to Mr. Hasty because he rushed everything. Mr. Hasty rushed eating his breakfast. He wouldn't wait for his porridge to cool. And then he would burn his tongue. And then he would rush off to the freezer and put his burning tongue on the ice. And then his tongue would get stuck to the ice. Then he'd rush through the traffic and get a speeding fine. There were all sorts of scrapes that Mr. Hasty got into because he did everything too fast. Now, as a builder, he was also very different from Mr. Take Care. Mr. Take Care did plans, had them passed by the council, built foundations, and made sure that everything was done slowly and properly in a way that ensured the best possible quality of building. But Mr. Hasty tended to say things like, "Who needs a foundation?" Or he'd say, "I don't need plans. I know what I'm doing." And he would go straight into action and start building the house. Now, at first, people liked this, but of course, going on, all kinds of problems started to pop up. Cracks appeared in the floor and the walls, and things started to break and fall off the house. In the end, Mr. Hasty was not regarded as the best builder. After telling the story for a while, I noticed that if I saw my son rushing something, all I needed to say was, "Are you being like Mr. Hasty?" And I'd get a giggle and visibly see him slowing down what he was doing and taking more care. So I really felt that the story worked. And it was a great alternative to a lecture. The beautiful thing about remedial stories is how children respond to them. Instead of that frustrating feeling of your child switching off when you know there's something that they need to hear from you, I had the opposite. I had children asking for the story. You never get that with a lecture, right? You never get children saying, "Oh, could you give me that lecture again? Or could you tell me off again the way you did last week when you were telling me important stuff?" You'll never get that response. But with a remedial story, you often have children requesting the very story you were trying to teach them something with and requesting it over and over. So the response is completely different with a remedial story. With a lecture, children switch off. With a remedial story, children engage, they move closer, they open their ears instead of closing them. So I find it's a great replacement. I think it's important to note here that when we're telling remedial stories, we don't hammer away right in the moment when we see something. It's sometimes better to walk away, think about it, and once you've formulated your story, find a good time where the child is receptive, like before bed, or just at a quiet time when you're enjoying spending time with your child, and tell them a story for enjoyment, but also a story which has a message in it. Because I think in that way, the child won't feel hammered on a point or told off through your story. We need to wait for a moment when the child is receptive, which is using our attunement. In other words, watching your child's signals to see when they might be open to a story. I'm sure that's quite often that they'd love to hear a story. So another lovely example of a remedial story, a mom was concerned about her daughter's bossiness. She noticed that when her daughter played games with the other children, her daughter was about 6 and the other children were a mixture of ages, she noticed that her child was very bossy and she was worried about how it was alienating the other children. So she waited a while, and one day while she had some time alone with her daughter, she started to tell her the story of the lonely bunny. And the lonely bunny started out as a bunny with friends, but a very bossy bunny with friends. Every time they played games in the forest, the bunny bossed everybody else around. She told them what to do and how to play, and when the other characters wanted to play a different game, She said, "No, we'll play my game." And when the other characters asked if they could play the game in a different way, she said, "No, only my way." After a while, the other little creatures in the forest spoke to each other and decided to play on their own without her. But of course, when they all went off to do this, the bunny found herself all on her own. Now, as the mother described how the bunny hopped through the forest and looked for her friends and was sad that she had no one to play with, the little girl burst into tears. "I'm the lonely bunny," she cried. "Really?" said her mom. "Are you lonely?" "Yes," said the little girl. "Why do you think that might be?" said the mom. And she genuinely listened. So there you can see how she switched to using some questions and some listening. And the little girl and the mom had a chat about being lonely and having friends and how one needed to play with friends so that they had a good time. But it wasn't a lecture. The remedial story had opened things up so that they could have a heart-to-heart. After that, when the mom was observing the playing, she saw a marked difference in the way her daughter played with the other children. Although she was still quite directive, which is a personality factor, some children are quite directive, she was definitely trying to accommodate the other children's wishes more in the game, trying to allow them to have more say. I could think of so many other examples of the remedial story, and I will make further videos on this, but that should give some idea for now. What I love about this skill, it's creative, you can enjoy making up the stories, it's fun for you and for the children, and you can look back on this intervention not as something that felt heavy or difficult between you and your child, but on a moment of connection, something that felt fun and memorable in a good way. Now, some of you may be thinking, but I'm not good at making up stories. Some parents really take to this skill, and others would rather read a story, and that's also fine. For those who would prefer not to make up a story, there's a lovely book written by Susan Perot called Healing Stories for Challenging Behavior. I can recommend that. Or you could try Googling with a search term like stories with a message, and you will see so many examples come up, fables and myths and other remedial stories, because this particular skill has been around for possibly as long as we have on this planet. So to sum up, instead of lecturing, try listening, or ask directly for what you want. Use the words next time, or explain to the child what you want in the moment and model it if necessary. Thirdly, you can use a remedial story, which would be a lot more fun for both you and the child. That's all for now. I hope you found these tips useful. Press like if you have, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll be back soon with more on what not to do in discipline and more suggestions of what we can do instead. If you'd like to find out more about other nonviolent discipline tools, visit the Peace Discipline website at peacediscipline.com. Thanks for watching.